I had been with Stellar Systems for 18 years, longer than most people stayed in one company. As a senior systems administrator, I was a core part of the team since the early days, back when we were still operating out of a tiny office, cobbling together the infrastructure that would eventually support the rapidly expanding company. Through every transition, every system update, I was the one who kept everything running smoothly. From implementing the first network systems to managing the seamless transition to cloud computing, I had been there through it all. I thought I was irreplaceable. But then came that Monday morning. The phone call was a bit unusual, and I had no idea what to expect. It was Tom, my direct manager, asking me to come into the office. A quick glance at the clock revealed it was only 9 a.m., far too early for any sort of regular meeting. When I arrived, I found Tom sitting in the conference room with Vanessa from HR. Neither of them looked me in the eye as they handed me a letter. It was a formal termination letter, stating that my position was being eliminated due to restructuring. My heart sank. I sat there in shock, struggling to process the words. Eliminated was the word that echoed in my mind. It didn't make sense. I had been here since the start. I had weathered so many changes, learned new technologies, worked countless hours, overtime without asking for compensation, holidays spent troubleshooting server issues, sleepless nights restoring the system after unexpected crashes. I had never asked for praise, never demanded recognition. But after all these years, I thought I had earned at least some acknowledgement, some loyalty from the company. "I'm sorry, Mark," Vanessa said, breaking the silence. "The decision has already been made. It's a corporate directive." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I could tell he didn't want to be there. I knew him well enough to sense that something was wrong, but I didn't press him. I'd been with the company long enough to understand how things worked. This wasn't personal, it was business. But even so, the sting of the abrupt decision was hard to shake. After a few awkward moments, I gathered my things. I didn't argue. I didn't fight for my position. I knew there was no point. Instead, I stood up, shook their hands, and left the office. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was no yelling, no pleading. I didn't want to seem desperate, even though inside, I was anything but calm. As I walked back to my desk to gather my personal items, I felt the weight of the situation begin to sink in. The office had never felt so cold before. The people I had worked alongside for years, the ones I had helped train, barely looked up as I passed them. Everyone was busy with their own tasks, absorbed in their own little worlds. It was as if I didn't matter anymore. When I finished gathering my belongings, I walked out of the building, not looking back. The decision had been made, and I was no longer a part of the company I had helped build. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something wasn't right. This wasn't just a simple case of corporate downsizing. There had to be more to it. I had been sidelined for months, excluded from major projects, and left in the dark about key decisions. I had suspected that something was wrong, that my loyalty wasn't being appreciated, but this was a slap in the face. I wasn't going to just walk away and accept it. I wasn't going to let this go. There had to be a reason behind my sudden dismissal, and I was going to find out what it was. I had spent years honing my skills, tracking down issues, solving problems, and finding solutions before anyone else noticed they existed. Now, I was going to apply that same determination to uncovering what had really been going on behind the scenes. The first step, I realized, was to investigate quietly, without drawing attention to myself. I didn't know how deep this went, but I suspected it was bigger than just a corporate reshuffle. I had the tools, the experience, and the inside knowledge to get to the bottom of this. I wasn't going to let them push me out without answers. It was time to take action. As the days passed, the initial shock of my termination began to wear off, but the sense of betrayal lingered. I had been loyal to Stellar Systems for nearly 2 decades. 18 years, longer than some marriages, longer than most people stay in a job. And yet, here I was, out of a job, without any real explanation, other than the vague corporate speak about restructuring. It didn't sit right with me. I wasn't just a cog in the machine, I had been the machine. I thought about the years I had invested in the company, about all the long hours, the weekends I had sacrificed, and the countless holidays I had spent troubleshooting systems while everyone else was at home with their families. I had built the IT infrastructure from the ground up. I had trained new hires, fixed network issues before anyone knew they were problems, and stayed up late to ensure that everything ran smoothly. I had worked with every department, ensuring that their systems were up to date and running efficiently. The company had grown significantly during my time there. When I started, it was just a small group of people working out of a cramped office. Over the years, we expanded, moved to larger offices, and eventually, as the company's needs grew, transitioned to the cloud. I had been the backbone of that transition. I knew the ins and outs of the company's systems better than anyone else. And yet, it seemed like all of that meant nothing when it came down to making decisions about the future. As I reflected on my years at Stellar Systems, I realized how much I had overlooked in my blind loyalty to the company. I had never once considered how expendable I might be. I had always trusted that my hard work and dedication would be recognized and rewarded. But now, it seemed clear that the company had been using me, valuing my skills only for as long as they were needed, and discarding me as soon as I no longer fit into their vision. It was frustrating, and I felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner. But I also knew that I wasn't the only one. There were other people in the company, people who had been in similar positions, who had given their all and gotten nothing in return. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. And I realized that I couldn't just let this go. I had to find out why this had happened to me, and if there was a bigger issue at play. I started digging through my old files. I had access to a wealth of information, and I knew exactly where to look. My position as senior systems administrator had given me access to financial records, company transactions, and internal communications that most others didn't even know existed. I had always made sure to back up important data for security purposes, and now, that precaution was about to pay off. The first thing I did was search for any documentation related to my termination. There had to be something, some memo or email, explaining why my position was eliminated. But after hours of searching, I found nothing. There were no emails, no memos, no internal discussions that explained the decision. It was as if it had come out of nowhere. But I didn't stop there. I started looking into the company's financial records. There had been whispers over the past few months about the company's finances, rumors about overspending and unexplained costs. As I dug deeper, I began to uncover something strange. There were large payments being made to a company called Apex Tech. The amounts were significant, millions of dollars over the course of the last year alone. And yet, Apex Tech was a company that none of us had ever heard of. There were no details about their services, no clear explanation of what they provided for the company. I felt a spark of suspicion. This didn't seem right. If a company was taking in that much money, there should be a record of the services they provided. But when I looked into the contracts, I found that the invoices were inflated, grossly inflated. On paper, it looked like they were providing IT services to the company, but the details were vague, and the prices were astronomical. I knew I had to investigate further, but I also knew I had to be careful. If I was caught snooping around, it could be used against me. So, I kept my findings to myself, working quietly at home. Every night, I reviewed the records, traced the transactions, and looked for any inconsistencies. The more I uncovered, the more I began to suspect that something much larger was going on behind the scenes. This wasn't just about my termination. This was about something much darker, a corporate scheme that had been running under everyone's noses for years. I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was a story here, one that no one had bothered to tell, and I was determined to be the one to expose it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of something huge, something that would shake the foundations of Stellar Systems. It had been several weeks since my termination, and with each passing day, my investigation deepened. The initial discoveries had only opened the door to something much more sinister, something that would take all of my skills and patience to uncover. The payments to Apex Tech were no longer just a red flag, they were the thread I needed to pull to reveal the entire web of deceit. I spent hours tracking down every transaction, cross-referencing them with internal records, and digging through company emails. It was painstaking work, but I had no choice. The more I uncovered, the more disturbing the picture became. Apex Tech wasn't just a vendor. It was a conduit for a far-reaching scheme that involved the highest levels of the company. The first sign of something truly wrong came when I discovered that Apex Tech had been receiving payments from the company for nearly 2 years. The payments weren't sporadic, they were regular, scheduled, and, according to the invoices, for routine IT services. However, when I looked closer at the invoices, they didn't add up. For one, the services listed didn't match the actual work the company needed or requested. Secondly, the prices were outrageously inflated. But that was only the beginning. As I continued to dig, I found that the payments to Apex Tech were tied to a set of invoices for consulting services that appeared completely fabricated. There was no mention of specific work or deliverables. Instead, there were vague descriptions, such as strategic planning and systems optimization, which could mean anything. I had worked in IT long enough to know that these kinds of contracts were often used to launder money or cover up fraudulent activities. But I couldn't make assumptions just yet. I needed proof. It took me several more days, but eventually, I found the smoking gun. One evening, while reviewing a series of old emails, I came across a chain that involved the CFO, a man named Richard Peters, and several individuals from Apex Tech. In the emails, they discussed how they would adjust the billing to ensure that Apex Tech could continue to invoice Stellar Systems for services that were never rendered. The CFO's involvement was clear, he was actively part of the scheme, orchestrating the fraudulent activities with the vendor. It wasn't just 1 or 2 irregular payments, it was a well-coordinated effort to siphon millions of dollars from the company. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered. Richard Peters wasn't the only one involved. The company's chief operating officer, a man named Greg Harding, was also implicated. He had been the one to sign off on many of the contracts, and it was clear that he had been receiving kickbacks from Apex Tech as well. I was shocked. In all my years working at Stellar Systems, I had never suspected that something so elaborate could be happening under the surface. I had always been proud of the work I did, always believed in the company's mission and values. Now, I felt like a fool. I wasn't about to let this go, though. I had the evidence I needed to expose the fraud, but I couldn't just throw it out there recklessly. If I went public with this without a plan, I could risk everything, not just my reputation, but my future as well. I knew I had to be strategic about how I handled this. The first thing I did was reach out to an old colleague, Robert Johnson, who sat on the board of directors. Robert and I had worked together for years, and I knew he was a man of integrity. He had always been a mentor to me, someone I respected. I needed him to see what I had uncovered and help me figure out the next step. After a few late-night phone calls, Robert agreed to meet with me. We arranged to meet at a local coffee shop, far away from prying eyes. I passed him the documents I had gathered, along with a detailed account of everything I had uncovered. He was as shocked as I had been when he saw the evidence. "Mark, this is bigger than I thought," he said quietly after reviewing the files. "You've done what I couldn't, this has to be exposed, but it needs to be done the right way." Robert promised to help me get the information to the right people, but he also cautioned me to be careful. He warned me that if the wrong people found out what I knew, I could be putting myself in grave danger. It wasn't just about money, it was about power, and those who had power in the company weren't going to give it up easily. I understood the risks, but I wasn't about to back down. I had been betrayed, but I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not after everything I had given to this company. Not after the years of loyalty. I knew that the truth would come out eventually. But first, I needed to make sure I had everything in place. I needed to expose the fraud without putting myself at risk. I wasn't done yet. The next step was to gather even more evidence, and I had a feeling the deeper I went, the more I would uncover. But one thing was for sure, the scheme I had uncovered was only the tip of the iceberg. The weeks following my meeting with Robert were a blur of activity. After I handed him the documentation, we both knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about exposing fraud, it was about exposing a system of corruption that had infiltrated the company at the highest levels. Robert was in agreement. He knew the consequences would be far-reaching, but he also knew that the truth had to come out. We devised a careful plan to expose the fraud. Robert, being on the board of directors, had access to the individuals who could make a difference. But we also knew that there was a chance the company would try to cover it up. It wasn't just the CFO and the COO at fault, this scam had been running deep for years, and the risk of retaliation was very real. I continued to work behind the scenes, gathering additional evidence and compiling everything I had uncovered into a detailed report. It wasn't just about the money anymore. As I dug deeper, I discovered that the fraud wasn't just limited to overbilling. There were false reports, cooked books, and personal benefits being funneled to key players in the company through fake contracts and inflated expenses. These weren't just mistakes, they were deliberate acts of deception, designed to line the pockets of those in charge while the company itself suffered financially. Finally, the day came when Robert and I decided to take action. We set up a meeting with the board of directors. I was nervous, but I knew I had to be prepared for whatever came next. I couldn't let them brush this under the rug like they had done with so many other issues before. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early. I had sent an anonymous email to the board members, outlining the basics of what I had uncovered, but I knew they needed to hear the full story from me in person. Robert and I had agreed that I would present the evidence to the board, and he would back me up. The room was tense when I walked in. The board members were seated around the large conference table, their expressions unreadable. I could tell they had already been briefed by Robert, but they were still skeptical. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, but I could feel the undercurrent of suspicion and tension in the air. They all knew something was coming, they just didn't know what. When it was my turn to speak, I calmly laid out everything I had found. I explained how Apex Tech had been used as a front to funnel millions of dollars out of the company. I detailed the roles played by Richard Peters, Greg Harding, and others in the scheme. I showed them the emails, the invoices, and the financial records that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the company had been defrauded for years. As I spoke, I could see the board members' reactions shift. First, there was disbelief. Then, anger. And finally, a sense of betrayal. These were people who had trusted Richard and Greg, and now they were learning the truth. Some of them were visibly shaken, others just looked resigned to the fact that the company's reputation had been tarnished. But there was no turning back now. It wasn't just about money. It was about justice. And I wasn't going to let the people who had betrayed me, and the company, get away with it. Richard Peters, the CFO, sat at the far end of the table, his face pale as I presented the evidence. He tried to interrupt, but I wasn't having it. This wasn't the time for excuses. This was the time for accountability. When I finished, there was a long silence in the room. No one spoke. The tension was palpable. Finally, one of the board members, a woman named Susan Holloway, spoke up. "This is a serious matter," she said, her voice steady but filled with disbelief. "Richard, Greg, do you have anything to say for yourselves?" Richard Peters hung his head, his face flushed with shame. Greg Harding remained silent, his eyes downcast. Neither of them had the courage to deny what had been laid out before them. It wasn't long before the truth began to unravel. Richard admitted his involvement, and Greg, though silent, could no longer deny his role in the scheme. The board members were outraged, and the company's legal team was immediately brought in to begin an investigation. The fraud was uncovered, and those responsible were removed from their positions. Richard was escorted out of the building by security, his face a mixture of defeat and anger. Greg, too, was let go, though he left without a word. But I wasn't finished yet. Instead of seeking monetary compensation or recognition, I asked for one thing: justice. I didn't want my old position back. I didn't need a promotion or a pat on the back. What mattered to me now was ensuring that the company was held accountable for the actions of its leaders. In the aftermath, the company's leadership was restructured. And as a result, I was offered a new role, the Chief Information Security Officer. It wasn't the role I had envisioned for myself, but it was a significant step up, and it allowed me to protect the company from further harm. I accepted the position, but I made it clear that I wouldn't be going back to my old role as a systems administrator. I had gained something much more valuable: my integrity. 6 months later, I had fully settled into my new role. The company had started to rebuild, and the damage from the fraud was slowly being repaired. I didn't feel joy in my victory. There was no satisfaction in seeing the people who had wronged me lose everything. But I felt a deep sense of pride in knowing that I had made a difference, that I had stood up for what was right when no one else would. And in the end, that was enough for me.